Anne Frank actually do all day? It is a question that sounds almost too simple, and yet when you sit with it for a moment, you realize just how profound it truly is. We all know the name Anne Frank. We know the diary. We know the tragedy. Millions of people around the world have read her words, visited her hiding place, or seen her story depicted on stage and screen. And yet, despite all of that familiarity, most people have only a vague sense of what her daily existence actually looked like inside those cramped hidden rooms above a canal-side warehouse in occupied Amsterdam. What did she eat for breakfast? How did she spend the long, silent hours of the morning when the warehouse workers were below and no one could make a sound? What did she read? What did she write? What did she dream about? What did she argue about? What did she fear? What was it like to be 13, then 14, then 15 years old, trapped in roughly 450 square feet with 7 other people, unable to step outside, unable to run or shout or simply be a child in the world? In this video, we are going to step behind the famous bookcase, through the hidden door, and into the daily life of Anne Frank. We are going to trace her mornings and her evenings, her studies and her writing, her meals and her conflicts, her friendships and her fears, and the remarkable inner world she constructed in the most constrained of circumstances. What we will find is not simply a story of endurance, but a story of a fiercely intelligent, deeply complicated, and astonishingly creative young woman who fought every single day against the deadening weight of confinement. So without further ado, let us open the bookcase door and step inside. To understand what Anne Frank did all day, you first need to understand the world she had been living in before the hiding began, and the terrifying sequence of events that brought her family to that building on Prinsengracht. Anne was born, Annelies Marie Frank, on June 12, 1929, in Frankfurt, Germany, to Otto Heinrich Frank and Edith Frank, née Hollander. She had an older sister, Margot Betty Frank, who was born in 1926. The Frank family was Jewish, secular in practice, and thoroughly assimilated into German bourgeois society. Otto Frank was a businessman and a decorated veteran of the First World War, having served as a lieutenant in the German army. He was, by all accounts, a warm, cultured, and thoughtful man who loved literature and the arts and believed deeply in the values of European civilization. Anne inherited much of his temperament. She was curious, quick-witted, stubborn, and possessed of a natural inclination toward people and stories. Even as a young child, she was known for talking at length, for asking difficult questions, and for performing elaborate games and stories for whoever would watch. When Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists came to power in Germany in January 1933, Otto Frank recognized the danger quickly. He had seen the anti-Jewish rhetoric escalating for years and understood that Germany under the Nazis would not be a safe place for his family. He began making plans to emigrate. By the summer of 1933, he had moved to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where he established a Dutch subsidiary of the Depicted company, which manufactured and sold pectin, a gelling agent used for making jam. Edith and the girls followed shortly after, settling in the Dutch capital and gradually building a new life. Anne learned Dutch, made friends, attended a Montessori school on the Neerstraat, and by all accounts, thrived. She loved movie stars and collected photographs of her favourites. She loved reading, especially myths and legends, stories about royalty and novels. She loved talking and socializing and being the center of attention at parties. Her childhood in Amsterdam, while shadowed by the knowledge of what was happening to Jews in Germany, was by most measures a normal and happy one. Then, in May 1940, Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands. The country fell in 5 days, and everything changed. Anti-Jewish legislation began almost immediately, enacted with a thoroughness and speed that stunned the Dutch Jewish community, which numbered around 140,000 people. Jewish-owned businesses were required to register. Jews were expelled from Dutch universities. They were barred from public parks, from libraries, from cinemas, from restaurants, from sports grounds, from public swimming pools, from markets. They could not ride on trams. They could not own bicycles. They were required to wear a yellow 6-pointed star on their clothing at all times, marked with the word Jude, the Dutch word for Jew. They had a curfew. Their movements were restricted. Their telephones were confiscated. Jewish children were removed from non-Jewish schools and required to attend segregated Jewish schools. Anne Frank, who was 10 years old when the occupation began, had to leave her Montessori school and transfer to the Jewish Lyceum. She made new friends there, and her famous diary begins with references to those friendships and to the social world of her Jewish school. But all of it was happening under an ever-tightening net of persecution, and by the spring and early summer of 1942, mass deportations of Dutch Jews had begun. The Nazis were systematically rounding up Jewish men, women, and children and sending them east to what were described as work camps, but were in reality, for most, death camps. Otto Frank had already been thinking about a hiding place. He had discussed the possibility with his most trusted employees, particularly with Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler, who ran the Opekta business with him, and with Miep Santruschitz, known to everyone as Mep, who was a young Austrian-born office worker employed by the company, and who had become deeply close to the entire Frank family. Together, they had identified the back portion of the building at 263 Prinsengracht as a possible hiding place. The building was a narrow four-storey canal house typical of Amsterdam architecture, dating to the 17th century. The front portion housed the Opekta offices on the second floor and warehouse space on the ground floor, where spices were processed. The back portion, connected to the front by a doorway on the second floor landing, had several floors of rooms that had previously been used for storage and laboratory work but were now largely empty. Over the months preceding July 1942, Kleiman, Kugler, Miep, and another office worker named Bep Voskuil secretly prepared these back rooms as a living space. They brought in beds, furniture, cooking utensils, food supplies. They stocked shelves with canned goods and dried beans. They installed a small stove in the upstairs kitchen area. They hung blackout curtains to prevent any light from escaping through the windows at night. And they kept all of it completely secret from the other warehouse workers who knew nothing about the plan. Then came the morning of July 5th, 1942, when 16-year-old Margot Frank received a call-up notice ordering her to report for a work assignment with the German Labour Service. Everyone understood what this meant. It was not a genuine work assignment. It was a summons to deportation. Otto Frank moved the family's timetable forward immediately. That very evening, he began alerting the helpers. The following morning, July 6, 1942, the Frank family left their apartment at 37 Merwiedeplein before dawn. Anne was not told exactly what was happening until that morning, and she later described the shock of it in her diary. The hurried departure, the rain, the layers of clothing she had to wear because a suitcase would have been too conspicuous for a Jewish family on the street. She wore 2 pairs of underpants, 3 pairs of trousers, a dress, a skirt, a jacket, a summer coat, and 2 pairs of stockings, all layered on top of one another. She tucked her diary, which she had received as a birthday present just 3 weeks earlier, into a satchel. She and her family walked through the rain to Prinsengracht, a journey of roughly 2 kilometres, and crossed the threshold into hiding. Anne Frank was 13 years old. She would not step outside that building again for the rest of her life. The space that became Anne Frank's world is today one of the most visited museums in Europe, and yet even those who have stood in those rooms often struggle to fully comprehend what it meant to live in them. The secret annex, which Anne called the Achterhuis in Dutch, meaning the back house, was reached by passing through the swinging bookcase on the second-floor landing of the main building. This bookcase, constructed by Bep's father, Johannes Voskuil, a warehouse worker who was one of the few additional people trusted with the secret, was filled with grey archival files and looked completely unremarkable. Behind it was a door, and beyond that door was a small, steep staircase leading up into the hidden rooms. The total living space of the annex was approximately 450 square feet, though it spread across 3 levels. On the second floor, entering from the bookcase, there was a small bathroom with a toilet and a wash basin. Next to it was the room that Otto and Edith Frank shared, a modest space with a few pieces of furniture and walls that Anne would eventually cover with photographs and postcards she cut from magazines and newspapers. This room also served during the day as a shared sitting area. Across a short landing was a larger room that initially belonged to Anne and Margot together, though Margot slept on a folding bed. The third floor had the largest room in the annex, which would be used as a combined kitchen, dining room and living space for the entire group during evenings, and which was also the bedroom of Herman and Augusta van Pels. Next to it was a smaller room for their teenage son Peter and a bathroom. Above all of this was a small attic, which was used for storing food and which also had a skylight window, the only window in the annex through which it was safe to look out onto the world with any degree of openness. The windows in all the inhabited rooms were covered with thick curtains and later with sheets of blue paper that had been specially prepared to block the light. This was essential not only to avoid detection at night, but also to maintain the illusion during the day that the rooms were uninhabited. The building's neighbours could potentially see into the back portion if curtains were pulled aside during daylight hours, and the slightest sign of life in windows that were supposed to be empty storage rooms could have been catastrophic. This meant that from the moment the warehouse workers arrived each morning until the moment they left in the evening, the inhabitants of the annex had to essentially pretend not to exist. They could not speak above a whisper. They could not walk normally because footsteps could be heard on the floors. They could not flush the toilet because the sound carried through the pipes. They could not run, could not cough loudly, could not move chairs, could not drop anything. The warehouse was directly below parts of the annex, and its workers, though honest and hard-working people, did not know about the hiding. The fear was constant, and the restrictions were total. This was the daily reality that Anne Frank woke up to every morning. And so the question of what she did all day begins with understanding what she was not allowed to do, because those constraints shaped everything else. She was not allowed to open a window and breathe fresh air during the 9 or 10 hours of the working day. She was not allowed to go outside for a walk, or to see sunlight falling on a street, or to hear normal city sounds without the accompanying terror that every footstep or voice might mean discovery. She was not allowed to use water freely because running water made noise. She was not allowed to visit a library or a bookshop or a cinema or a park or a friend's house. She was not allowed, in any ordinary sense of the word, to simply live. And yet she did live fully and intensely in ways that continue to astonish everyone who reads her diary carefully. How? That is precisely what we are going to explore. The day in the secret annex began early. The helpers arrived at the building around 8:30 in the morning to begin the working day, and from that moment on, silence was required. But before 8:30, there was a window of relative freedom. The inhabitants of the annex woke up around 7 o'clock in the morning, sometimes earlier. This was the period during which they could move more freely, speak in normal voices, use the bathroom without worrying about sound carrying, and prepare themselves for the long, silent hours ahead. Anne, who was by her own cheerful admission not a natural early riser, often struggled to wake up promptly. She mentions in her diary her hatred of the cold mornings, particularly in winter when the annex was frigid, and her reluctance to leave her warm bed. The heating in the annex was limited and unreliable. During the winter months of 1942 and 1943 and 1944, the cold was a constant and grinding presence. The rooms were drafty, the walls old, and there was simply not enough fuel or warmth to make the space genuinely comfortable. Anne wrote in her diary in January 1943 that they were all so frozen they barely knew what to do with themselves. They sat huddled under blankets, unable to get warm. Later, in the winter of 1943 to 1944, fuel shortages made the situation even worse. The cold became one of the defining sensory experiences of life in hiding. Once out of bed, the morning routine was governed entirely by the ticking clock and the arrival of the helpers downstairs. Anne would wash herself using the wash basin in the small bathroom using carefully rationed water. Bathing was not possible on a daily basis given the limited water supply and the logistical difficulties of the space. Instead, each person in the annex had a designated bathing time once a week, and they used whatever containers were available. Anne describes the complicated logistics of bathing in her diary with a mixture of complaint and humour. Peter Van Pels, the teenage son of the second family, bathed in the kitchen downstairs on Sunday mornings when the building was empty, having the relative luxury of the largest tub. Anne and Margot and Edith made do with smaller arrangements. Anne's designated bathing spot was, at one point, the small area behind the front office on the second floor of the main building, which was accessible from the annex side and which offered slightly more space, though it required sneaking through the building in a way that always carried a small risk. She described getting dressed and undressed in the kitchen in the dark in order not to be seen through the windows from outside, which she found both awkward and amusing. Even the most basic aspects of personal hygiene required careful planning and creative adaptation. After washing and dressing, breakfast was prepared and consumed before the helpers arrived. The food situation in the annex was complex and varied significantly depending on the period. In the early months of hiding, when the helpers were still building up the food supply and when the occupation of the Netherlands had not yet reached its most desperate phase, meals were relatively adequate, if not luxurious. Over time, as the war continued and food became scarcer, both for the helpers to obtain and for the annex to store, the quality and variety of meals declined significantly. Breakfast in the early period might include bread, butter, jam, milk, and perhaps a boiled egg. But as conditions worsened, breakfast increasingly consisted of nothing more than dry bread and ersatz coffee, a coffee substitute made from roasted grain that tasted nothing like real coffee and which Anne found deeply unpleasant. She writes about food with remarkable frequency and specificity throughout her diary, which tells you a great deal about its centrality to daily life when you have so little else to focus on. The cooking in the annex was done primarily on the upper floor in the Van Pels family's kitchen area, using a small gas stove. Auguste Van Pels, whom Anne called Mrs. Van Pels in her diary and gave the fictional surname Van Pels in the version she later revised, was the primary cook for the group during the early period of hiding, a fact that generated considerable tension given Auguste's strong opinions about how cooking should be done and her proprietary attitude toward the shared kitchen. Herman van Pels, Auguste's husband, was a businessman who had been Otto Frank's partner and who had extensive knowledge of spices and curing meats, which proved unexpectedly useful in the annex. He was in charge of portioning out the meat and managing the harder-to-obtain food supplies. Anne's account of meal preparation and the constant arguments over food portions and recipes is both funny and revealing. Food was not just sustenance in the annex. It was one of the few sources of variety in an otherwise completely static existence, and it was also a primary site of conflict among 8 people trapped together in an extremely small space. The helpers, Miep Gies, Bep Voskuil, Johannes Kleiman, and Victor Kugler, were the lifeline that made all of this possible. Without them, the 8 people in the annex would have starved within weeks, to say nothing of the constant risk of discovery that the helpers also bore. Miep Gies, who was 26 years old when the hiding began, was perhaps the most central figure among the helpers. She had been working for Otto Frank since 1933 and was devoted to the family with a loyalty that went far beyond anything that could reasonably have been expected of her. Every single working day for the 2 years and 1 month of the hiding period, Miep came to the building, conducted her normal office work in the front rooms, and then slipped up to the annex to bring food, news, and whatever else the 8 people needed. She shopped for them every day, visiting multiple different markets and shops to avoid arousing suspicion by buying too much in any one place. She brought bread, vegetables, milk, and occasionally special treats. She brought them books from the public library, borrowing them on her own card. She brought them newspapers, magazines, and news of the outside world. She was also their primary emotional connection to the life outside the bookcase door, and the people in the annex waited eagerly each day for her arrival, not just for the practical supplies she brought, but for the normalcy and warmth she represented. Bep Voskuil was the youngest of the helpers, only 22 years old at the start of the hiding. She was the daughter of Johannes Voskuil, who built the bookcase, and she too came to the annex regularly with food, library books, and news. Bep was particularly close to Margot and to Anne, and the 2 young women in the annex relied on her to obtain the correspondence course materials that allowed them to continue their education during the hiding period. Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler, the 2 male helpers, managed the business on the ground and provided the organizational cover that made the hiding possible. Kleiman was gentle and thoughtful, often suffering from serious stomach ailments that hospitalized him periodically throughout the hiding period. Kugler was more reserved and businesslike, but equally committed to protecting the people upstairs. The 5 helpers, for Jan Gies, Miep's husband, also helped in various ways, though he was not a daily presence, risked their lives every single day. Under Nazi occupation, harboring Jewish people was punishable by death or deportation to a concentration camp. Every one of them knew this. None of them wavered. When the helpers arrived at 8:30 in the morning, the annex fell silent. This was one of the most psychologically demanding aspects of life in hiding, and it is easy to underestimate just how oppressive enforced silence for 9 or 10 hours a day, every single day for over 2 years, can be. Anne describes it in her diary with increasing frustration as the months go on. There was almost nothing she could do during silent hours that involved any kind of physical movement or sound production. She could not pace the floor. She could not go to the toilet. She could not run water. She could not speak to anyone in more than a whispered murmur. She could not laugh out loud. In the early months before the inhabitants had fully established their routines, even accidentally dropping a fork sent everyone into a paralyzed panic. She describes one incident in which a hammer slipped from someone's hand in the storeroom directly above the warehouse and fell with a tremendous clatter, causing every single person in the annex to freeze in absolute terror until it became clear that the workers below hadn't heard anything unusual. So what did Anne Frank actually do during those long, silent hours? She read, she wrote, she studied, she thought, she daydreamed, she quarrelled in whispers with her mother, and then felt guilty about it. She gazed at the wall covered with the photographs and postcards she had pinned up to make the room feel less like a cell. She thought about the future, about what she wanted to become, about boys, about freedom, about the smell of rain and the feeling of grass under her feet, and all the other sensory experiences of ordinary life that she had been cut off from. And she wrote. Above all things, she wrote. But let us trace the full shape of the day before we come back to the writing, because the writing cannot be fully understood without understanding the larger context of daily life in which it existed. Once the working day began and silence descended, Anne typically settled at the small table in her room with her schoolbooks and correspondence course materials. Education was one of the things that Otto Frank had insisted on maintaining throughout the hiding period, and it became one of the primary structuring elements of daily life in the annex. Anne and Margot both worked through correspondence courses in several subjects, obtaining the materials through Bep Voskyle, who enrolled in the courses on their behalf so their names would not appear in any official records. Anne studied shorthand, which she learned from a Pitman method booklet that Miep and Bep procured for her. She studied French and English, working through grammar books and vocabulary lists. She studied Dutch history and literature. She studied algebra and geometry, which she found difficult and which she battled with in her diary with cheerful self-deprecation. She studied Latin at least briefly before concluding it was too hard and setting it aside. She kept detailed notebooks of her progress and wrote out exercises and essays, creating a small but genuine academic record of her time in hiding. Margot was, by all accounts, the more naturally studious of the two sisters, methodical and disciplined in her approach to learning in a way that Anne admired and occasionally resented. But Anne studied with genuine effort and a real hunger for knowledge, even if her approach was more erratic than her sisters'. The annex had accumulated a reasonable collection of books over the period of its preparation, and Miep's weekly trips to the public library supplemented this with a constantly rotating supply of novels, histories, biographies, and other reading material. Books were one of the most important lifelines in the annex, and all 8 of its inhabitants were readers to varying degrees. Anne was a voracious reader who consumed books quickly and had strong opinions about what she liked and disliked. She had been a reader before going into hiding, but the enforced stillness of life in the annex transformed reading from a pastime into an absolute necessity. Over the more than 2 years of hiding, she read an extraordinary number and variety of books. She read Dutch literature, including the novels of Sissy van Marksveld, particularly the Joop ter Heul series, a Dutch series of semi-autobiographical novels about a young woman's coming of age that Anne adored, and that directly influenced her own diary writing style, particularly in the early months when she addressed her diary entries to an imaginary friend. She read Greek and Roman mythology, of which she was deeply fond, and she kept careful notes on the gods and heroes and their stories, creating her own mythological reference book by hand. She read Dickens. She read biographies of historical figures, particularly strong women of history, whom she collected. With the same enthusiasm she brought to collecting photographs of film stars. She was fascinated by Dutch history and the history of the Dutch royal family, reading multiple books about Queen Wilhelmina and the House of Orange. She also read about religion, and her diary shows a gradual and thoughtful engagement with questions of faith. The Frank family was not religiously observant before going into hiding. They celebrated some Jewish holidays but were primarily secular and culturally assimilated. In the annex, religious practice took on new dimensions. The Jewish holidays were observed, though resources for proper celebration were limited. Hanukkah was celebrated in December, and Anne and Margot received small gifts. Passover was acknowledged. Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah were observed. But alongside these Jewish traditions, Anne also read about and contemplated Christianity, having grown up in a largely Christian country and having many close Christian friends and helpers. Her religious thinking in the diary is genuinely exploratory and open-minded, neither fully settled in Jewish practice nor drawn toward conversion, but searching, asking questions, and trying to understand her place in a larger spiritual universe. This searching quality was characteristic of her intellectual life more broadly. She was not a person who accepted, received opinions passively. She questioned, challenged, tested ideas against her own experience, and formed her own judgments. The Van Pels family had arrived in the secret annex approximately 1 week after the Franks, on July 13, 1942. Hermann Van Pels was a portly, good-humoured businessman from Osnabrück in Germany who had worked with Otto Frank in the spice trade. His wife Auguste was a lively, talkative and opinionated woman, somewhat older than Edith Frank, with a great fondness for nice things, a sharp sense of humour, and a talent for making enemies in enclosed spaces. Their son Peter was 16 years old when the hiding began. A lanky, somewhat shy and inarticulate young man who had brought his cat, Moshi, with him into hiding, a fact that caused some practical difficulties with the resident mouse population in the storerooms. Anne's first impressions of the Van Pels family in her diary are characteristically direct and not always flattering. She describes Auguste Van Pels as someone who talks constantly and whose opinions on cooking and housekeeping are exhausting. She describes Peter Van Pels as boring and dim. She will revise both of these assessments dramatically as the months in hiding stretch into years. The last person to arrive in the annex was Fritz Pfeffer, who came on November 16, 1942, bringing the total number of inhabitants to 8. Pfeffer was a 53-year-old German Jewish dentist who had practiced in Berlin before emigrating to Amsterdam, where he had a Dutch girlfriend named Charlotte Coletta. He was a friend of the Franks, though not an intimate one, and his arrival was arranged through the helpers after it became clear that his situation outside the annex was becoming increasingly dangerous. Anne gave him the fictional name Albert Dussel in the diary she later revised, the German word Dussel meaning something like nitwit or dunderhead, which tells you immediately what she thought of him. Pfeffer moved into Anne's room, displacing her from her space and requiring her to share the small bedroom with a middle-aged man she found irritating in the extreme. He was pedantic, self-important, and deeply uninterested in her as a person or in the writing she was clearly so committed to. He monopolized the shared desk in the room during the afternoons, when Anne most wanted to write, an arrangement that caused chronic friction. Their daily cohabitation was, by Anne's account, one of the more difficult aspects of life in the annex, and she devoted considerable diary energy to cataloguing his failings. 8 people sharing 450 square feet for 2 years created friction that was, in retrospect, entirely predictable, and yet never ceased to generate fresh eruptions of conflict, complaint, and wounded feelings. The daily rhythms of the annex were punctuated by the kind of low-level social tensions that emerge whenever human beings are confined together without the ability to step outside and recover their composure. Meals were often the focal point of these tensions. The question of food portions, of who had eaten too much of the butter or the jam or the last of the sugar, was a recurring theme. The Van Pels family had different eating habits and different ideas about cooking from the Franks. Auguste Van Pels's cooking, which she was deeply proud of, was the source of constant negotiation and occasionally open dispute. Hermann Van Pels had a habit of taking larger portions than strictly fair, which caused Edith Frank quiet but visible distress. Pfeffer ate in a particular and fussy way that annoyed almost everyone. And through all of it, Anne watched, absorbed, and wrote everything down. By midday, if the helpers were present and the working day was continuing, the annex was still in its enforced silence. Lunch was prepared and eaten in the upper kitchen living room, as quietly as possible. The helpers sometimes joined the annex inhabitants for lunch, coming upstairs after locking the office door, and these visits were among the high points of the day. Maep Gies describes in her own memoir the lunches she shared upstairs, the feeling of temporary normality they created, the pleasure of sitting around a table with people she loved and eating together. She brought news of the outside world, reports on how the war was going, gossip from the neighbourhood, information about mutual friends and acquaintances. The people in the annex were completely cut off from all direct sources of information, except what the helpers brought and what came through the radio, and so these midday conversations were precious. They talked about everything, from the progress of the Allied campaign to the price of vegetables at the market to the latest films being shown in Amsterdam, which none of the annex inhabitants could, of course, attend. The afternoons in the annex during the working day were the quietest and in many ways the most difficult hours. The morning studies could continue and reading was always available, but the afternoon brought a particular quality of monotony that Anne struggled against throughout the hiding period. She describes the afternoons sometimes with an almost physical sense of oppression, the feeling of time moving unbearably slowly, of being enclosed, of the walls pressing in. She had terrible headaches during this period, almost certainly related to the combination of poor ventilation, constant tension, insufficient sunlight, inadequate nutrition, and the sheer psychological weight of enforced confinement. She also had persistent colds and respiratory illnesses, which in the stuffy, poorly ventilated annex were both common and miserable. She was a teenager with enormous physical and emotional energy, and the suppression of that energy, day after day, for month after month, took a real toll. It was during the long afternoon hours, after her studies were done and before the helpers left for the day, that Anne did much of her most sustained writing. She had her diary, of course, but over time the diary evolved into something far more than a simple record of daily events, and alongside it, she worked on other projects that she took with deep seriousness. She wrote short stories, fairy tales, and personal essays. She began a project she called the Book of Beautiful Sentences, a collection of passages she found particularly striking in the books she read, copied out by hand into a dedicated notebook. She wrote sketches and character studies of the people around her. She began in the spring of 1944, a semi-autobiographical novel she called Cadie's Life, a project she had been thinking about for some time and which drew on both her diary and her imaginative life. And after she heard a radio broadcast in late March 1944 in which the Dutch Minister of Education in exile specifically called on Dutch citizens to preserve their diaries and documents of occupation as historical evidence, she began systematically revising and rewriting her diary from the beginning with the explicit intention of turning it into a published book after the war. This revised version, which she was still working on when the annex was raided on August 4th, 1944, is the basis of the diary as the world knows it today. The radio was perhaps the single most important object in the secret annex, after the diary and the food supplies. It sat in the private office of Victor Kugler on the main floor of the building, and the inhabitants of the annex could listen to it in the evenings after the warehouse workers had left. The radio was their window onto the wider world. Their source of news about the war, and one of their primary forms of entertainment. They listened to the BBC from London, which broadcast Dutch-language programming and was the most trusted source of information about the progress of the war. They listened to Radio Oranje, the broadcast of the Dutch government in exile from London, which provided news and messages of encouragement. They listened to music programs. They listened to drama and news broadcasts in English, French, and German, all of which at least some members of the annex could understand. Listening to the BBC was illegal under Nazi occupation and punishable by severe penalties. But this prohibition was ignored by virtually the entire Dutch population, and certainly by everyone in the annex. The radio was too important, too vital a connection to reality and to hope, to be given up for anything. News from the radio shaped the emotional temperature of daily life in the annex in profound ways. Good news from the front, reports of Allied advances or German setbacks, lifted spirits, and sparked animated dinner table discussions. Bad news depressed everyone for days. The invasion of North Africa in November 1942, the Allied landings in Sicily in July 1943, the Italian armistice, the steady retreat of German forces on the Eastern Front after the catastrophe at Stalingrad, the Allied bombing of Germany, the gradual sense that the tide of the war was turning, all of these were followed with intense attention and emotional investment. Anne wrote about the progress of the war with the engaged interest of someone who understood that the liberation she longed for depended entirely on the outcome of battles being fought thousands of kilometers away by people who had no idea she existed. She tracked the movements of armies, noted the names of generals, speculated about timelines, and allowed herself to hope, sometimes cautiously and sometimes with a rush of excitement that she recognized might be premature. When the warehouse workers left the building in the early evening, usually around 5:30 or 6 o'clock, the atmosphere in the annex changed immediately. There was an almost physical release of tension. Voices could be raised again, the toilet could be flushed, chairs could be moved, people could pace the floor and stretch their legs in what little space was available. The evening was the most sociable and in some ways the most normal part of the day. The entire group of 8 would typically gather in the upper kitchen living room of the Van Pels family for dinner, the one meal of the day at which all 8 people sat together. These dinners were the social centre of life in the annex, and they were a complicated mixture of genuine warmth and barely suppressed conflict. There was real affection among the group, particularly between Otto Frank and the various inhabitants, all of whom loved and respected him. There was also a great deal of irritation and resentment accumulated over months of enforced proximity that bubbled up at the dinner table with some regularity. After dinner, the evenings were spent in various ways depending on individual preference and the particular dynamics of the night. Otto Frank often read or listened to the radio or engaged in serious conversations with Herman van Pels about business and economics. Edith Frank read, often religious texts, and sewed or mended clothing. Margot studied, wrote letters that she would never be able to send, and read. Herman van Pels sometimes worked on small practical tasks or played cards. Augusta van Pels talked at length about whatever was on her mind. Fritz Pfeffer listened to the radio with intense concentration and wrote letters to his girlfriend Charlotte. Peter van Pels retreated to his small room with his cat, and Anne wrote in her diary and talked with her father, and increasingly, as the months went by, found her way upstairs to Peter's room for the conversations that would become one of the most significant emotional developments of her time in hiding. The evenings also occasionally brought entertainment in a more organised form. The inhabitants of the annex celebrated birthdays, and these were high points in the calendar that everyone looked forward to with genuine anticipation. A birthday in the annex was not the kind of party Anne had been used to outside, with friends and decorations and a table full of presents, but it was something. The helpers made special efforts to bring treats or small gifts. Mayap would obtain extra food for the occasion, perhaps a cake made from whatever was available, or a special pudding. Otto Frank, who had a gift for meaningful gestures, always prepared something thoughtful for his daughter's birthdays, often a poem or a small homemade gift that showed how closely he had been paying attention to what they loved. Anne describes her birthdays in the diary with both gratitude and a barely concealed grief for the celebration they could not be. Her 14th birthday, on June 12, 1943, brought her a book of Greek and Roman myths, a packet of sweets, a jar of yogurt, and several other small presents, which she was clearly delighted by. Her 15th birthday, on June 12, 1944, just weeks before the end, brought a novel by a Dutch author and a book about botany, subjects she had expressed an interest in. The Jewish holidays were also observed and marked, giving the annex calendar a religious structure that helped organise the weeks and months into something with more shape than the otherwise undifferentiated passing of days. Hanukkah was celebrated in December 1942 and December 1943 with the menorah lit and small gifts exchanged. Passover in the spring was observed with as much of the traditional ritual as could be managed given the limited resources. These holidays mattered not just religiously but psychologically, as anchors of identity and continuity in circumstances that otherwise threatened to strip everyone of both. Anne wrote about the holidays with a mixture of faith and doubt, gratitude and longing that captures something important about how the 8 inhabitants of the annex tried to maintain their humanity and their sense of who they were in conditions designed ultimately to eliminate them entirely. Let us now turn to the thing Anne Frank did more than almost anything else, the thing that has made her famous, the thing that stands as her greatest achievement and her most lasting gift to the world. Let us talk about the diary. Anne received the red and white plaid diary for her 13th birthday on June 12, 1942. It was a small autograph album that she had chosen herself from the window of a bookshop near her house, and she immediately decided to use it as a diary rather than an autograph book. She began writing in it on her birthday, just 3 weeks before the hiding began. In those first weeks of diary writing, before she went into hiding, she was writing the diary of a normal, teenage girl, albeit one living under occupation. She wrote about school, about friends, about boys she liked, about her teachers, about the social dramas of adolescence. She was funny and sharp and observant, and her voice was distinctive from the very first entries. But the diary she began writing after July 6, 1942, was something else entirely. The diary that Anne Frank wrote during the hiding period is one of the most remarkable documents in 20th century literature, and this is not simply because of its historical circumstance, though that circumstance is obviously extraordinary. It is remarkable because Anne Frank was genuinely extraordinarily talented as a writer, and because the diary reveals a mind of unusual depth and sophistication, developing at astonishing speed under conditions that would have crushed many adult spirits entirely. To understand what she did all day, you need to understand the diary not just as a record of events, but as an artistic project that she took with complete seriousness and dedicated enormous energy and intelligence to. Anne's initial approach to the diary followed a format she had encountered in the Joop ter Heul novels by Sissy van Marksveld, books she loved deeply and which influenced her thinking about the possibilities of diary writing. In those novels, the protagonist writes her story in the form of letters to a circle of girlfriends. Anne adapted this device for her own diary, addressing her entries to an imaginary friend she called Kitty. She explains in an early entry why she chose this approach. She had many friends and acquaintances, she wrote, but no true friend, no one to whom she could tell everything she thought and felt without any reservation. The diary addressed to Kitty would serve as that friendship. Kitty was not based on any real person, though Anne had a friend named Jacqueline van Marsen before the hiding whom she liked very much. Kitty was a pure invention, a projection screen for everything. Anne needed to say and had no one to say it to. This was not mere literary device, it was a genuine psychological strategy for managing the isolation of hiding, a way of creating the experience of intimate friendship in the complete absence of its reality. The early diary entries written in the summer and autumn of 1942 are vivid and chatty and often very funny. Anne writes about her family and the other inhabitants of the annex, with sharp, sometimes merciless observation. She describes the daily routines, the food, the rules, the absurdities of their situation. She writes about reading and about studying. She writes about what she misses from her life outside. She writes about nature, which she was passionate about, and about how much she misses being able to see it properly. She writes about her feelings about the war and what is happening to Jewish people in the occupied Netherlands. She had some understanding of the deportations that were happening, though not the full horror of what awaited the deported. She writes about fear, about boredom, about hope. She writes about being an adolescent, about the confusing and powerful physical and emotional changes she is experiencing, about boys, about her developing sense of herself as a woman and a person. What is immediately striking about the early diary entries is their energy. Anne Frank at 13 was not a depressed or defeated child. She was not passive or submissive. She was restless, funny, occasionally maddening, and full of a life force that the walls of the annex could not contain. She chafes constantly against the restrictions imposed by the hiding. She argues with her mother. She resents being treated as a child by the adults around her. She has strong opinions about everything and expresses them with complete conviction. She is, in other words, a normal and rather feisty teenager who happens to be living in abnormal circumstances, and the contrast between her vibrant, ordinary adolescent selfhood and the extraordinary conditions she is navigating gives the diary its particular charge from the very beginning. As the months in hiding stretched on, the diary deepened and changed. The entries from 1943 show Anne becoming more reflective, more questioning, more self-critical. She begins examining herself with the same sharp eye she turns on everyone else, and she doesn't spare herself. She writes about her faults, her vanity, her tendency to say things that hurt people, even when she does not mean to, her relationship with her own emotions, which she often describes as running away with her in ways she cannot fully control. She is troubled by the gap she perceives between her outer self, the cheerful, sarcastic, entertaining Anne, who performs for the group, and her inner self, the more serious and sensitive Anne she keeps largely hidden. This theme of the divided self runs throughout the diary from roughly mid-1943 onward, and it is one of the things that makes her most interesting and most recognisable to readers of every generation and background. Who has not felt that gap between the person you show the world and the person you know yourself to be? Who has not felt that their truest self was somehow invisible to the people closest to them? Anne was giving language to one of the central experiences of adolescence, and she was doing it with a clarity and precision that most adults never achieve. The question of how much of the day she spent actually writing is worth addressing directly because it tells us a great deal about her habits and her dedication. Anne did not write a diary entry every single day, though in some periods she came close. Some entries are brief, a paragraph or two recording a specific event or feeling. Others are long and elaborate, sometimes running to several pages of densely written prose. She wrote in Dutch, her primary language since the age of 4, and her Dutch prose style developed noticeably over the 2 years of the EU. Diary. The early entries are fluid but relatively simple. The later entries, particularly from early 1944 onward, are more structured, more carefully crafted, more consciously literary. She was learning to write, not just recording events, but actively developing her craft, and the diary is the record of that development in real time. She also revised and rewrote. After hearing the radio broadcast in March 1944, in which Gerrit Bolkestein, the Dutch Minister of Education in exile, appealed to Dutch citizens to preserve their wartime diaries and documents for historical purposes, Anne made the decision to revise her diary completely and transform it into a publishable book. She began rewriting from the first entry, changing names, adding context, cutting material she considered too personal or too trivial, reshaping scenes and conversations to read more fluently, and generally polishing the prose. She worked on this revision throughout the spring and early summer of 1944, producing what scholars now call the B version of the diary to distinguish it from her original unrevised A version. Both versions survive, the unrevised diary in the notebooks she wrote in, and the revised version on loose sheets of coloured paper she had obtained for the purpose. The version published as The Diary of a Young Girl in 1947 was assembled by Otto Frank from both versions, combining material from the original and revised texts. This revision project is one of the most remarkable aspects of Anne Frank's activity in the Annex. It demonstrates that she was not simply writing for herself as a private release, but that she had genuine ambitions as a writer and a clear vision of what she wanted to create. She wanted to be a writer after the war. She said so explicitly and repeatedly, and her diary was the practice ground for that ambition. She had titles in mind for the published version of her diary. She settled on the title Het Achterhuis, The Secret Annex, as the name of the book she intended to publish. She thought about her potential readership, about what they would find interesting and what they might find tedious, and she made editorial decisions based on those thoughts. This is not the behaviour of a child keeping a private journal. This is the behaviour of a serious, self-aware writer planning her work for publication. The fact that she was 15 years old makes it almost unbelievable, and yet the evidence is right there in the diary itself, in the careful revisions, the deleted entries, the reworked sentences, the structural choices she made as she rewrote. Alongside the diary, Anne was at work on other writing projects throughout the hiding period. She wrote short stories, completing a number of them over the 2 years of hiding. These stories, some of which were published after the war, along with the diary, range from fairy tales in a traditional fanciful mode to more realistic sketches based on scenes and people from her own life. She wrote one called The Wise Old Gnome, a fantasy tale with a moral dimension. She wrote one called Eva's Dream, a semi-autobiographical story about a young girl's vision of another world. She wrote sketches of Annex life that are thinly disguised versions of things she'd experienced or observed. These stories show the same qualities as the diary: the sharp observation, the humour, the emotional intelligence, the instinct for the telling detail. But they also show something that the diary, being necessarily personal and immediate, does not always show. Anne's capacity for imaginative projection, for stepping outside her own experience and into other consciousnesses, for constructing narrative structures with beginnings, middles and ends. She was also, in the spring and early summer of 1944, working on Katie's Life, the semi-autobiographical novel she had mentioned in her diary. We know relatively little about this project because only fragments of it survived, but what survives suggests a young woman, beginning to find her way toward longer-form fiction, drawing on her diary material and transforming it into something more novelistic in shape. She never finished it. The raid of August 4th, 1944, interrupted everything, but the fragments show that she had genuine novelistic instincts, a sense of scene and character and pacing that went beyond what the diary's necessary immediacy allowed. We cannot talk about what Anne Frank did all day without talking in depth about the relationship that became the most emotionally significant and absorbing event of her time in hiding after the writing itself. That relationship was with Peter Van Pels, the shy, unassuming 17-year-old boy who occupied the small room on the 3rd floor of the annex, above the kitchen. Anne had dismissed Peter in her early diary entries with cheerful condescension. She described him as boring, awkward, and uninteresting, someone with whom she had nothing in common and whom she found faintly irritating. She could not have predicted that he would become, for a period of months in 1944, the most important person in her world. The change happened gradually, in the way that these things do. In the early months of 1944, roughly 18 months after the hiding began, Anne began spending more time in Peter's room in the evenings. She has already noted in her diary that she is going through a period of intense introspection and loneliness, a feeling of being fundamentally misunderstood by everyone around her, even her father, whom she loves deeply. Her relationship with her mother has been deteriorating for months. Her friendship with Margot, while warm, is constrained by the sisters' different personalities and by Margot's natural reserve. Fritz Pfeffer is impossible. The Van Pels adults are exhausting. And then there is Peter, in his room with his cat, quiet and self-contained and strangely available. What began as casual conversations gradually became something much more. Anne began going up to Peter's room in the attic area every afternoon, ostensibly to get air near the skylight window, which was the one place in the annex where it was possible to feel something like outdoor air on your face and to see a patch of sky. But the conversations with Peter became the reason in themselves. They talked about everything, about their families and their feelings about the hiding, about their hopes for the future, about the books they were reading, about the war, about their own personalities and the ways they felt misunderstood. Peter was not as intellectually sophisticated as Anne, and she was aware of this, but he had a gentleness and a willingness to listen that she found deeply comforting. He was the first person, she wrote, to whom she felt she could say things she had never said to anyone. By February 1944, Anne was clearly in love with Peter, or something very like it, and the diary entries from this period have an intensity and a glow that make them feel qualitatively different from what came before. She writes about him constantly, analysing every exchange, every look, every casual touch. She describes going up to his room in the attic each day as the high point of her day, the thing she looks forward to from the moment she wakes up. She writes about their first conversation where he called her by her first name instead of the formal address. She writes about the moment in early April 1944 when he put his arm around her, and she rested her head against his shoulder and they sat together in the quiet attic, looking out through the skylight at the sky above Amsterdam. She writes about their first kiss, which happened in mid-April 1944, with a mixture of joy and solemnity, as if she understood that this was not merely a teenage crush but something genuinely meaningful, a connection formed in extraordinary circumstances that would mark her for the rest of her life. The relationship with Peter also generated one of the most interesting and little discussed dynamics in the entire diary, which was the complicated triangular tension between Anne, Peter, and Margot. Margot had told Anne in a private note exchanged between the sisters that she too had feelings for Peter, but that she did not act on them because she understood that he and Anne were drawn together and she did not want to interfere. This letter, which Anne reproduced in her diary, is one of the most moving documents in the annex record, a moment of extraordinary generosity and dignity from the older sister. Anne was deeply moved by it and wrote about it with great tenderness, but she also continued to pursue the relationship with Peter, understanding that Margot had given her blessing, even if it cost Margot something to do so. The three of them navigated this with more grace and less drama than most adults would have managed in similar circumstances. Otto Frank was aware of the developing relationship and was quietly concerned about it, not for moral reasons, but for practical ones. He wrote Anne a letter in which he expressed his affection and his worry that the intensity of the connection, in the forced proximity of the annex, might develop too quickly and go further than was wise or appropriate. Anne received this letter thoughtfully, acknowledged that her father was probably right, and then largely continued as she had been, though more consciously. She was intensely aware of her father's feelings about everything, because her relationship with Otto Frank was the most important and most complex of all her relationships. The Frank family relationships deserve their own careful examination because they shaped so much of what Anne did and thought and felt during the hiding period. Her relationship with her father Otto was one of profound mutual devotion and also, inevitably, of conflict and misunderstanding. Anne worshipped her father in the early period of hiding and turned to him for everything, for comfort, for advice, for Intellectual companionship for the reassurance that someone understood and loved the real her. Otto Frank was by all accounts an exceptional father, patient and emotionally intelligent, and genuinely interested in his children as individuals. He read to them, studied with them, talked with them seriously about ideas and events. He treated Anne's opinions with respect, even when she was wrong, and he engaged with her writing and her intellectual development with real attention. Anne describes him in her diary with enormous love, as almost perfect in her eyes, and the affection is plainly real and deep. But as she grew older and as the emotional pressures of hiding accumulated, her relationship with her father became more complicated. She began to see him not just as a protector and guide, but as a person, with his own limitations and vulnerabilities. She noted in her diary that he was not always able to give her the specific kind of emotional understanding she needed, that his love was real but sometimes missed the target of what she was actually feeling. After his letter about Peter, she felt for the first time that her father did not fully understand her in the way she had always believed he did. And this was a kind of growing up, a loss of a particular innocence that she processed with sadness, but also with what she clearly recognized as necessary maturity. She loved her father completely. She also came to see him as something other than perfect. Both things were true. Her relationship with her mother, Edith, was almost the inverse of this. Where the relationship with Otto was characterized by ease and warmth, the relationship with Edith was characterized by friction, distance, a mutual misunderstanding that neither woman fully knew how to resolve. Anne's diary entries about her mother are some of the most painful in the entire text, not because they are cruel, though some of them are harsh, but because they show a young woman and an older woman failing to connect across a generational and temperamental divide that the circumstances of hiding made almost impossible to bridge. Edith Frank was a gentle, religious and quietly strong woman who had her own burdens to carry in the annex. She was deeply worried about her children and her husband. She was separated from everything familiar and comfortable. She suffered from the same depression and fear that afflicted all the annex inhabitants, but she expressed it quietly and inwardly rather than in the externalized way that Anne needed from her. Anne wanted her mother to engage with her intellectually and emotionally, to treat her as an equal, to confide in her and be confided in. Edith wanted to mother her child in the way she knew how, with protection and guidance and gentle authority. The gap between what each wanted from the other was wide, and the circumstances did not allow the time or space to cross it. Anne wrote some very painful things about her mother in the diary, including statements that she did not love her mother and could not see her as a mother, only as a woman. She later acknowledged the cruelty of these entries and was troubled by them. When she revised the diary in the spring of 1944, she softened some of the harshest material about her mother, though not all of it. The published diary still contains entries that are difficult to read if you know what happened to Edith Frank, who died in Bergen-Belsen in January 1945, 2 weeks before Soviet troops liberated the camp, having given her daughters her own meagre food rations to try to keep them alive longer. Anne did not know what her mother would do. She could only write what she felt, and what she felt was real, even if it was also incomplete and unfair in the way that most adolescent assessments of parents are. The relationship with Margot was easier and more affectionate than the relationship with Edith, but it was also never fully close in the way that Anne longed for. Margot was 3 years older, which in adolescence is a considerable gap, and she was also a very different type of person. Where Anne was volatile and emotionally expressive and unable or unwilling to hide her feelings, Margot was composed and contained and careful. Where Anne was combative and resistant to authority, Margot was cooperative and studious and obedient. They loved each other genuinely, and as the months in hiding went on, they grew closer in some ways, exchanging notes and having more intimate conversations about their feelings and their fears and their hopes. But Anne always felt that Margot could not be the kind of friend she needed, the kind of unconditional, depth-of-the-soul friend that she had sought all her life. This was not a fault of Margot's, it was simply a difference of temperament. Anne was looking for something that perhaps no real person could ever fully provide, which is one of the reasons why Kitty, the imaginary friend of the diary, served such an important function. The days in the annex also had a rhythm shaped by the seasons, in ways that outsiders might not immediately think about. Summer brought intense heat to the poorly ventilated rooms, particularly in the afternoons when sunlight had been warming the building for hours. The lack of open windows made the heat build to almost unbearable levels. Anne describes lying on her bed in July and August, sweating through her clothes, unable to do anything but try to stay still and endure it. The heat also brought bugs, flies, mosquitoes, and other insects that tormented the inhabitants at night, made worse by the fact that opening windows for ventilation was dangerous and limited in its possibilities. The summer of 1944 was particularly hot, and the last weeks before the arrest were physically uncomfortable in ways that added to the already considerable psychological pressure everyone was under. Autumn in the annex meant the gradual cooling of the building and the shortening of days, which brought its own particular difficulties. As the days got shorter, the hours of relative freedom in the evenings also shortened, because darkness fell earlier and the restrictions around light and noise became more complex. The early autumn also meant the Jewish high holidays, which the annex observed with whatever resources were available. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in the autumn of 1942 and 1943 were marked with prayer and solemn reflection, offering moments of collective purpose in an existence that otherwise risked becoming purely reactive to circumstances. Winter was perhaps the most physically difficult season. The cold was constant and penetrating. The fuel for heating was limited, and became more limited as the war continued, and supplies throughout occupied Europe dwindled. Anne describes huddling under blankets during the coldest periods, wearing multiple layers of clothing indoors, keeping her feet off the cold floor. The cold also brought respiratory illness, which spread quickly. Through 8 people living in close quarters, almost everyone in the annex suffered from persistent colds and coughs during the winter months, and the forced suppression of coughing during daytime hours when the warehouse workers were present was both physically painful and a constant low-level source of anxiety. There was medicine available, primarily aspirin and throat lozenges and the kind of basic remedies that Mipe could obtain from the chemist, but there was no doctor, and the fear of serious illness in a situation where seeking proper medical care was impossible was a constant shadow. Spring in the annex was the season of greatest hope. As the days lengthened and the weather warmed, the quality of light coming through the windows improved even through the blackout curtains, and there was something about the idea of spring, of renewal, of a world alive and growing outside that reliably lifted spirits. Anne's diary entries from the spring months, particularly the spring of 1944, have a quality of heightened aliveness that reflects both the season and her developing relationship with Peter, the two things combining to make those weeks feel, in retrospect, like the fullest and richest period of her time in hiding. It was in the spring of 1944 that Anne climbed the attic stairs to the small skylight window most regularly and looked out at what she could see of the world. From the attic through the skylight, she could see a patch of sky and the crown of a tall chestnut tree in the garden behind the building. That chestnut tree became one of the most important symbolic presences in Anne's inner life. She wrote about it repeatedly, describing how it looked in different seasons and different weathers, how its changing appearance marked the passage of time, how looking at it felt like having access to something vast and real that the walls of the annex could not contain. She described a night in February 1944 when she and Peter sat together in the attic in darkness, watching the tree and the sky through the open skylight, and she wrote that there are moments when she cannot understand how any human being can be sad in the presence of such beauty. The chestnut tree was her access point to the natural world, her proof that the world outside was still alive and beautiful, and her connection to something larger and more permanent than the fear and the tedium and the suffering of daily life in hiding. The actual chestnut tree in the garden of 263 Prinsengracht became diseased in later years and eventually fell in a storm in 2010, 65 years after Anne's death. It had become a symbol so powerful by that point that its loss was mourned internationally, and cuttings from it had been used to grow new trees that were planted at sites around the world associated with Anne Frank's memory. The nights in the annex were complex. There was some fear associated with nighttime that went beyond the ordinary human response to darkness in a confined space. During the first months of hiding, the annex inhabitants were particularly anxious about the possibility of a break-in at night. The warehouse below the annex stored valuable goods, including spices and other materials, and Amsterdam under occupation had its share of desperate people willing to take risks. There were in fact several break-ins during the hiding period, or apparent break-ins, and each one sent a shock of terror through all 8 inhabitants as they heard sounds from below that could have been thieves, could have been Nazi officers, could have been the end of everything. One of the most dramatic incidents in the diary comes in the spring of 1944, when Anne describes a night of terror after what sounds like a break-in in the warehouse below, with everyone in the annex frozen in silence, whispering to each other in the dark. Otto Frank and Herman van Pels going downstairs to investigate and finding that someone had indeed broken through the door. And then the stomach-clenching horror when a beam of light was played across the bookcase from the other side, and they thought for a moment that they had been discovered. They had not been. It was likely a thief who had no idea what was behind the bookcase. But the experience left everyone shaken for days, and Anne wrote about it with a vividness and emotional truth that makes the reader's heart pound even now. She also suffered from nightmares. This is not surprising, given the circumstances, but it is worth naming because it is part of the texture of daily life in hiding that is easy to overlook. Anne had recurring nightmares about friends and family members who had been taken by the Nazis, about her own arrest, about the concentration camps that everyone feared being sent to. She mentions a particular nightmare that haunted her for months, involving her friend Lise Goossens, who was a close friend from before the hiding, and who had also gone into hiding with her family, but in less successful circumstances. In the nightmare, Lise appears to Anne dressed in rags, thin and suffering, asking Anne why she has everything when Lise has nothing. This nightmare troubled Anne deeply, and she wrote about it with great pain, acknowledging the guilt of survival and the knowledge that her own relative safety was not something she had earned, but something she had been given by chance and by her father's foresight and by the courage of her helpers. She thought often about the people she had left behind, about the Jewish friends and neighbours and classmates who had been taken in the deportations, about what was happening to them, about whether she would ever see them again. The question of what Anne Frank knew about the Holocaust, and when she knew it, is one that scholars and readers have debated for decades. It matters because it bears directly on what she was doing all day in a deeper sense, the sense of how she was processing the world outside the annex, what she understood about the fate of the people who had been rounded up and sent east, and what she feared for herself and the 7 other people hiding with her. The answer, based on careful reading of the diary alongside historical scholarship, is that Anne knew quite a lot, and that what she knew was deeply frightening, even if she did not know the full systematic horror of the extermination camps. By the autumn of 1942, just a few months after going into hiding, Anne was writing in her diary about rumours that Jewish deportees were being gassed. She had heard this from the helpers, who had themselves heard it from various sources. She wrote about it with a mixture of horror and a kind of bewildered denial, the human mind's natural resistance to accepting information that is almost too terrible to integrate. She writes that she cannot let herself believe it is as bad as people say. She writes that she thinks about all the Jews being taken away and feels helpless and frightened. As the war progressed and reports from the outside world became more explicit, the understanding of what the deportations meant hardened into something less ambiguous. By 1944, she was writing with greater clarity about the fate of those taken east, and her diary entries on this subject have a sobriety and a weight that reflect genuine knowledge rather than mere rumour. This knowledge of what was happening to others shaped Anne's daily psychological state in ways that cannot be separated from the more mundane aspects of her life in hiding. She experienced genuine survivor's guilt. She was aware that her relative safety, however precarious, was a form of privilege denied to millions of others. She tried to deal with this by being grateful, by refusing to let herself be consumed by self-pity, by insisting to herself and to her diary that she still had things to be thankful for, that the world was still beautiful, that people were still fundamentally good. This insistence on gratitude and on the essential goodness of human beings is the most famous aspect of Anne Frank's diary, the quality that has made it so meaningful to so many millions of readers across so many decades. But it is important to understand that this was not a naive or uninformed optimism. It was a hard-won, deliberately maintained position taken in the full knowledge of how terrible the world could be, an act of what might be called spiritual resistance. There is a famous passage in the diary, written in July 1944, just weeks before the arrest, in which Anne writes that, in spite of everything, she still believes that people are really good at heart. This sentence has been quoted so often that it has become almost a cliché, removed from its context and stripped of the complexity that gives it its actual force. But in context, that sentence is not the expression of a sheltered child who doesn't know any better. It is the conclusion reached by a 15-year-old girl who has had 2 years to contemplate the worst that human beings can do to each other, who knows that people are being murdered in their thousands and millions, who has heard sounds in the night that froze her blood, who has watched the adults around her crack and despair and sometimes behave very badly under pressure, and who has nonetheless decided, deliberately and with full awareness of the evidence against her position, to maintain her belief in human goodness. That is an extraordinary moral and intellectual act, and understanding it in context rather than as a slogan changes its meaning entirely. What else was happening in Anne Frank's daily life that we have not yet addressed? There is the question of her physical development, which she herself addressed with a frankness that surprised some early readers of the diary, and which her father removed from the version he published in 1947, before later restored editions reincorporated it. Anne was 13 when she went into hiding, and she turned 15 before the arrest. During those 2 years, she experienced puberty, and she wrote about it in her diary with a combination of curiosity, wonder, embarrassment, and the kind of matter-of-fact observation that characterized all her self-examination. She wrote about her changing body with interest and without shame. She wrote about menstruation when she experienced it for the first time, describing it as a secret and a physical experience she felt she should treat with dignity. She wrote about her developing interest in the opposite sex. She wrote about the physical changes she observed in herself and in Peter. She wrote about sexuality with a teenager's mixture of fascination and uncertainty. None of this was inappropriate or excessive. It was the natural self-examination of an intelligent young woman going through the universal biological experiences of adolescence while confined in an extremely unusual space. But it was part of her daily life, and any honest account of that life has to acknowledge it. The physical health of everyone in the annex deteriorated over time, and this too was a constant dimension of daily life. The inadequate diet, the lack of fresh air and sunlight, the absence of exercise beyond the most limited pacing, the chronic stress and the poor ventilation all combined to erode the physical resilience of all 8 inhabitants. Vitamin deficiencies were common. Anne mentions taking vitamin supplements that MAIP obtained for them, and she describes feeling tired and run down at various points throughout the diary. She had persistent dental problems, which were treated by Fritz Pfeffer, who was a dentist and who performed some basic dental work using the equipment he had brought with him into hiding, though conditions were far from ideal. Anne found these dental appointments extremely unpleasant and wrote about them with characteristic humour, describing Pfeffer as unnecessarily rough and clinical in his bedside manner, which probably said as much about their difficult relationship as it did about his actual technique. The helpers brought books from the Amsterdam Public Library on a regular basis, rotating them as they were read, and the selection of books available to the annex inhabitants was both a source of enormous pleasure and occasionally a point of friction. All 8 people had reading preferences, and not all of them coincided. The adults, particularly Otto Frank, favoured serious literature and history and biography. August van Pels liked lighter material, romantic novels and popular fiction. Herman van Pels was not much of a reader. Peter van Pels was selective in his reading, but when he found a book he liked, he read it intensely. Anne read everything with equal enthusiasm, jumping from a mythology compendium to a Dutch novel, to a biography of Napoleon, to a history of the Dutch West India Company, without pausing to draw breath. She had a genuinely omnivorous intellectual appetite, and she treated the library books as one of her primary resources against boredom and despair. Miep later recalled that Anne went through books at such speed that it was sometimes difficult to keep her supplied. The library visits were not the only form of cultural life available in the annex. The helpers also brought magazines and newspapers which provided news and also lighter fare. Anne was particularly interested in one Dutch magazine called Cinema and Theatre, which covered the film industry and which she read avidly from cover to cover. She had been an avid film-goer before going into hiding and had accumulated a collection of photographs of film stars that she pinned to the wall of her room. The photographs became one of the defining visual details of her living space, and the wall covered with film star images was one of the things that greeted Otto Frank when he returned to the annex after the war, to find it ransacked and emptied. The photographs were still there, on the wall, where Anne had placed them. Diana Durbin, Greta. Garbo, Norma Shearer, Clark Gable, Ginger Rogers, and many others stared out from the wall of the room that had been Anne's, in the building that had become their tomb. Anne was deeply interested in history, and she pursued this interest with considerable seriousness during the hiding period. She read Dutch history extensively, particularly focused on the 17th century Golden Age and on the history of the Dutch royal family. She was interested in genealogy and created detailed family trees of the Dutch royal family and of various historical dynasties for her own amusement and education. She read biographies of historical figures and found herself particularly drawn to strong and independent women, to women who had achieved things in periods when women were not expected to achieve anything. She read about Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, about Elizabeth I of England, about Florence Nightingale, about Marie Curie. She collected information about these women the way she collected information about everything she was interested in, copying out passages and facts into notebooks, creating her own personal reference library within the Annex's paper resources. The question of what Anne Frank's understanding of her own Jewishness was during the hiding period is one that the diary illuminates with considerable complexity. As we have noted, the Frank family was secular and assimilated, not religiously observant in any strict sense. Anne had attended a Jewish school during the occupation, but primarily because she was forced to, not because of any deep religious conviction. In the Annex, religious practice took on new significance, partly as a comfort and partly as a way of maintaining identity under conditions that threatened to erase it. The Jewish holidays were observed, but Anne's engagement with her Jewishness during the hiding period was more philosophical and existential than strictly religious. She thought about what it meant to be Jewish, about why Jews had been made the target of such hatred, about the history of Jewish persecution across centuries, about whether she was primarily Jewish or primarily Dutch or primarily a European human being. These questions, posed by a 15-year-old in a hidden attic, go to the heart of some of the deepest identity questions of modernity, and she asked them with a genuine intellectual seriousness. She also wrote about her aspirations for the future. Anne had no patience with the assumption that she would spend her life as a wife and mother, as women of her generation and background were generally expected to do. She wanted to be a writer and a journalist. She said this explicitly and repeated it throughout the diary. She wanted to travel the world. She wanted to study and to work and to make something of herself in the world by her own efforts. She had a strong will and a strong sense of herself as a person whose inner life and intellectual ambitions deserved to be taken seriously. She wrote at one point that she could imagine herself as a journalist or a politician or a public figure, someone who contributed to the world rather than merely inhabiting it. She was aware that these ambitions were considered unusual for a girl of her time and background, and she resisted the idea that her gender should determine the scope of what she could achieve. This feminism, which she never named as such but which was clearly present in her thinking, is another aspect of her diary that modern readers recognise and respond to immediately. The attic space above the Annex, which she shared most frequently with Peter during their afternoon conversations, was also where she did some of her most private thinking. Away from the crowded lower rooms, away from the constant social dynamics of the group, she had a small measure of solitude and height, and from the skylight she could look out and up into a rectangle of sky that was, in good weather, blue and brilliant and full of the kind of light that reminded her of everything outside. She wrote about these moments of looking at the sky with a lyrical intensity that reveals something about how she managed the experience of confinement. She was capable of finding transcendence in small things. She could be fully absorbed and transported by the quality of afternoon light, by the sight of a bird flying across the skylight, by the patterns of clouds. This capacity for acute, grateful sensory attention was both a personal gift and a survival strategy, a way of finding richness in conditions that were, objectively, profoundly impoverished. The burglaries and near discoveries that punctuated the hiding period deserve a more detailed examination because they reveal something important about the daily reality of the fear that all 8 inhabitants lived with. The Annex was broken into 3 times by thieves during the 2 years of hiding. The first burglary occurred in April 1943 when thieves broke into the warehouse overnight and stole some goods. The second was in July 1943. The third and most frightening was in March 1944, the incident Anne described in such gripping detail, when the thieves broke through the warehouse door and the beam of light was played across the bookcase. In each case, the terror of discovery was extreme. The inhabitants of the annex were entirely at the mercy of circumstances they could not control, dependent on their invisibility remaining intact, on no one ever noticing the slightly unusual smell of 8 human beings living above a warehouse, on no one in the building ever mentioning anything to anyone that might attract attention, on no thief ever being curious enough about the wall of archival files to push against it. There were also denunciations to worry about. The Nazi occupation of the Netherlands included a system of rewards for information leading to the discovery of hidden Jews, and there were Dutch informers who made it their business to ferret out hiding places and report them. After the war, considerable historical research went into trying to identify who had betrayed the Frank family and the others in the secret annex. For decades, the primary suspect was a warehouse worker named Willem van Maren, who had been taken on after the original warehouse manager left and who had shown a suspicious curiosity about the building that made the helpers nervous. Van Maren was investigated twice after the war and again in the 1960s, but the evidence against him was never conclusive. Later research focused on other possible informants. In 2016, a Dutch detective named Vince Pankoker led a cold case investigation using modern forensic and analytical techniques that concluded, in 2022, that the most likely betrayer was a Jewish notary named Arnold van den Berg, who may have provided the Nazis with lists of hiding addresses in exchange for protection for his own family. This conclusion was immediately contested by other historians and remains disputed. The full truth of who betrayed the secret annex has never been definitively established, and it is possible it never will be. What is certain is that on the morning of Friday, August 4th, 1944, a member of the German security police named Karl Silberbauer arrived at 263 Prinsengracht with 4 or 5 Dutch collaborators. They entered the building, went directly to the bookcase on the second-floor landing and opened it. They had been told exactly where to go and exactly what they would find. The people in the annex were caught completely off guard. The raid happened at around 10:30 in the morning, in the middle of the working day, when everyone was engaged in the usual activities of the silent hours. Anne was probably writing. Margot was probably studying. The adults were engaged in various quiet occupations. They had no warning. The door was opened, the men were there with weapons, and it was over. The arrest itself was orderly rather than violent, at least in the first moments. Silberbauer was an Austrian SD officer who was described later by those present as businesslike rather than brutal. He ordered everyone to put their hands up and to pack a bag with essential belongings. He went through the rooms with his colleagues, pulling out drawers, overturning furniture, looking for hidden valuables and documents. He found Otto Frank's briefcase, which contained his business papers and the original notebooks and loose sheets of Anne's diary. He emptied the contents onto the floor to use the briefcase for valuables. The papers fell and lay scattered on the floor of the room. No one picked them up. There was nothing to pick them up for. The time for writing was over. Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman were arrested along with the 8 annex inhabitants and taken to the Gestapo headquarters. Bep Voskuil and Miep Gies, who had been in the front office, were questioned but released. After the arrested people had been taken away, Miep Gies went back upstairs. She found the annex ransacked, emptied, desolate. She found the papers on the floor and she gathered them up. She did not read them. She put them in her desk drawer and kept them there. She kept them safe through the end of the occupation, through the chaos of liberation, through the weeks and months that followed the war, in the hope that Anne would return and want them back. She did not read them because she thought they were Anne's personal private writings, and it would be wrong to read them without her permission. She kept them for Anne. Anne never came back. The fate of the 8 people who were arrested from the secret annex on August 4th, 1944, is one of the most heartbreaking epilogues in all the literature of the Holocaust. They were taken first to the Gestapo headquarters at Uterpeststraat in Amsterdam, then transferred to the detention centre on Weiteringsschans, and then, on August 8, 1944, just 4 days after their arrest, they were transported to Westerbork transit camp in the northeastern Netherlands. Westerbork was the holding facility through which the vast majority of Dutch Jews passed on their way to the extermination camps in the east. For a few weeks, all 8 annex inhabitants were housed there in the punishment barracks, because Jews who had been arrested in hiding were classified as criminals and subjected to harsher conditions than other prisoners. They had to perform hard labour, cleaning batteries used in German military equipment, which left their hands stained and acid-burned. The work was degrading and exhausting. But they were together, and they were still alive. On September 3rd, 1944, the last transport from Westerbork to Auschwitz departed. All 8 of the former annex inhabitants were on it. The train journey took 3 days, packed into overcrowded cattle cars with barely any food or water, no toilet facilities, and no information about where they were going or what would happen when they arrived. They arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau in the early hours of September 5th, 1944. Immediately on arrival, the men and women were separated. Otto Frank was separated from Edith, Anne, and Margot. Peter van Pels was taken away from his parents. Herman and Augusta van Pels were separated. Fritz Pfeffer was separated from everyone. A selection was carried out on the platform. Those deemed fit for labour were kept. Those deemed unfit, primarily the elderly, the sick, children under 15 and mothers of young children, were sent directly to the gas chambers. Anne and Margot, 15 and 18 years old, passed the selection. Edith Frank also passed. Herman van Pels passed. The others are more difficult to trace with certainty at this point, but this was where Fritz Pfeffer disappears into the transport and transit records of the Nazi system. Otto Frank, separated from his family on the platform, was sent to the men's section of the main Auschwitz camp. He would never see his wife or daughters alive again. Anne and Margot were initially housed in the women's section of Auschwitz-Birkenau, in the terrible conditions of the camp that has been described in so many survivor testimonies. The women's barracks were crowded beyond all rational capacity, flea-infested, cold at night and brutally hot during the day, with completely inadequate food and sanitary facilities. Disease was rampant. The daily routine was a degrading succession of roll calls, labour details, roll calls again, and the constant terror of further selection. Anne's head was shaved like everyone else's. She and Margot and Edith were housed together, and the 3 Frank women managed to stay close to each other during their time in Birkenau, which gave them a small measure of mutual support in conditions designed to strip people of every human comfort and dignity. In late October 1944, with the Soviet army advancing from the east and the Nazi leadership beginning to panic about the evidence of their crimes, Anne and Margot Frank were selected for transport to Bergen-Belsen, a concentration camp in Germany near Hanover. They were transported west on a train. Edith Frank was not selected and remained in Auschwitz. She was too weak to work and was moved to the sick barracks. She died there on January 6, 1945, the day after what would have been her 44th birthday. She had given her daughters her food rations to try to keep them alive. She died alone in the sick barracks of Auschwitz, which the Soviet army liberated just 16 days later on January 27, 1945. Edith Frank was one of approximately 1.1 million people who were murdered at Auschwitz. Bergen-Belsen in the autumn and winter of 1944 was catastrophically overcrowded. The camp had been built for a much smaller population, and as the Nazis moved prisoners westward ahead of the Soviet advance, the camp's population ballooned to many times its intended capacity. There was almost no food. There was almost no clean water. Disease, primarily typhus and dysentery, spread with terrifying speed through the malnourished and weakened prisoner population. The dead were not always buried. Bodies accumulated in the camp. Conditions were, even by the extreme standards of the Nazi camp system, almost beyond description. Anne and Margot Frank arrived at Bergen-Belsen in late October or early November 1944. They were among thousands of new arrivals trying to survive in conditions that were becoming more desperate with each passing week. They managed for a time to find a small measure of connection with the outside world. Hannelie Goslar, the friend Anne had seen in nightmares, had also been deported to Bergen-Belsen, having been caught with her family in a previous roundup. Hannelie Goslar later described in her own testimony encountering Anne at Bergen-Belsen. She heard Anne's voice from the other side of a fence that divided sections of the camp. She did not recognize her at first because the figure calling to her was so thin and so different from the Anne she had known. Anne was in rags. She said she was cold and that she had nothing. She said she didn't know where her father was. She did not know that her father was alive. She believed he was dead. They were unable to see each other clearly through the fence, but they talked. And Hannelie tried to throw a small package of food over the fence to Anne, only to see it intercepted by another prisoner. She tried again another time and succeeded. These exchanges through the fence at Bergen-Belsen are among the most unbearable moments in the entire story of Anne Frank. The girl who had once written about wanting to be a writer, who had filled pages with observations about human nature and declarations of belief in goodness, reduced to thin rags on the other side of a wire fence, not knowing her father was alive, asking her friend if she had any food. Margot Frank died first. The exact date is uncertain, but most historical estimates place her death in late February or early March 1945 from typhus. Anne died within days of her sister from the same disease. She had not yet turned 16. Bergen-Belsen was liberated by British troops on April 15, 1945. Anne and Margot had died perhaps 6 to 8 weeks before that date. If they had been able to survive just 2 more months, they would have been free. Herman van Pels had been sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz in October or November 1944, when he was deemed too weak to work. Augusta van Pels was transported through multiple camps, ultimately reaching Theresienstadt in the Czech Republic, where she died in 1945, the exact date unknown. Fritz Pfeffer died in Neuengamme concentration camp in Germany on December 20, 1944. Peter van Pels was evacuated from Auschwitz on the death march westward in January 1945 and was transferred to Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, where he died on May 5, 1945, just 3 days before the camp's liberation. Of the 8 people who hid in the secret annex, at 263 Prinsengracht, only 1 survived. Otto Heinrich Frank, Anne's father, was liberated from Auschwitz by Soviet troops on January 27, 1945. He was gravely ill and deeply weakened, but alive. He made his way back to the Netherlands over the following months, travelling through Odessa and Marseille on a journey that took until June 1945. He went back to Amsterdam. He found Miep and Jan Gies, who had sheltered him during the early weeks after his return. He waited, and he asked and he inquired about his daughters. He did not yet know what had happened to them. In late July 1945, 2 women who had been in Bergen-Belsen found him and told him that Anne and Margot were dead. He did not speak for the rest of that day. When Otto Frank had recovered enough to face what had to be faced, Miep Gies gave him the papers she had kept in her desk drawer. She gave him the notebooks and the loose sheets of Anne's diary that she had gathered from the floor of the annex on the day of the arrest, the pages that Silberbauer had scattered when emptying the briefcase. She said she had saved them for Anne to come back to, but Anne was not coming back, and so she gave them to her father. Otto Frank read his daughter's diary for the first time. He read the person she had been, the person he had never quite known because she had kept so much of herself hidden, even from him. He read her intelligence and her humour and her loneliness and her hopes and her fierce, unbroken determination to matter in the world. He read her ambitions. He read her love for him. He read the things she had said about her mother that pierced him. He read the private thoughts of the daughter he had lost. And he wept. After considerable hesitation, Otto Frank decided to fulfill Anne's wish. She had said she wanted her diary published. She had been revising it toward that end. He would see that it was published. He typed up the diary himself, combining material from the original notebooks and the revised loose sheets, making some editorial decisions of his own, including removing some passages he considered too intimate or too personal for publication, and sent it to several Dutch publishers. After initial rejections, it was published in the Netherlands in June 1947 by the firm Contact under the title Het Achterhuis, the title Anne had chosen. It was a modest publication with an initial print run of 1,500 copies. It sold out almost immediately. A second edition followed within weeks. By 1950, translations had appeared in French and German. In 1952, an English translation was published in the United States and Britain under the title Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. And it was an immediate sensation. It was adapted for the stage in 1955 by Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett, and the play ran on Broadway and later in theatres around the world. In 1959, it was made into a film that won 3 Academy Awards. In the decades since its first publication, The Diary of a Young Girl has become one of the most widely read books in the world. It has been translated into more than 70 languages. More than 30 million copies have been sold. It is taught in schools across dozens of countries. It has been read by children and adults, by Christians and Muslims and people of every faith and no faith, by people who lived through the events it describes, and by people born generations after they occurred. It has been the subject of academic scholarship, literary analysis, theatrical production, and personal testimonial across cultures and continents. It consistently appears on lists of the most important books ever written, and it is unique among those lists in having been written by a child. Anne Frank wanted to be a writer. She wanted her work to matter after the war. She wanted to go on living after her death through what she had written. In this she succeeded with a completeness, and on a scale that she could never have imagined. The building, at 263. Prinsengracht became a museum in 1960, opened at the initiative of Otto Frank in collaboration with the Anne Frank Foundation. Otto Frank devoted the rest of his life to preserving his daughter's memory and to the broader cause of tolerance and education about the Holocaust and the dangers of prejudice and hatred. He remarried in 1953 to Elfriede Geiringer, known as Fritzi, herself a Holocaust survivor. He moved to Basel in Switzerland, where he lived until his death on August 19, 1980, at the age of 91. He had spent 35 years carrying the weight of his survival and the grief of his losses, but he carried them with a dignity and a purposefulness that reflected the qualities his daughter had loved and described in him. He was the last person alive who had known Anne as she truly was in the secret annex, who had sat with her at dinner and listened to the radio with her and argued with her and loved her and been exasperated by her and been awed by her. And when he died, that direct human connection to her living presence passed out of the world. But what she left behind remained. The diary remained. The building remained. The photographs still pinned to the walls of her room remained, at least until the museum's conservators carefully documented them. And the question that this video set out to answer, the question of what Anne Frank actually did all day, has an answer that turns out to be as complex and as rich and as fully human as any life is when examined closely. She did ordinary things and extraordinary things. She ate bread and butter for breakfast, when there was butter. She studied shorthand and French and algebra. She argued with Fritz Pfeffer about the use of the desk. She fell in love with the boy upstairs. She sat with her father in the evenings and listened to the BBC. She went to the attic to look at the chestnut tree. She was cold in winter and hot in summer, and ill with colds in between. She had nightmares about her friend Lise. She quarrelled with her mother and felt guilty about it. She laughed with Margot. She ate too many red cabbage dinners and complained about the beans that seemed to be on the menu every time the food ran low. She daydreamed about going to Hollywood and about becoming a journalist and about what she would do when the war was over and she could finally open a window and walk down a street in the rain. And she wrote. Every day that she could, she wrote. She wrote with the conviction that words could hold onto the things that time and war and cruelty were trying to destroy, that writing the truth of her experience as carefully and honestly as she could was the most important thing she could do with the time she had. She wrote as if her life depended on it. And in a sense that she could not have fully anticipated, her life does depend on it, not the physical life that was taken from her in Bergen-Belsen in the late winter of 1945, but the other life, the life that belongs to everyone who has ever read her words and felt recognized, the life that goes on every time a reader opens her diary and hears a voice saying clearly and without self-pity, "This is what it is like to be alive inside these walls. This is what it feels like to be me. This is what I am doing with the hours I have been given." Anne Frank was in hiding for 761 days. During those days, she grew from a child into something that, had the world been different, would have grown into a remarkable woman. She studied and read and wrote and loved and feared and hoped and argued and thought and looked out at the sky. She did all the things that human beings do when they are alive and paying attention, and she did them with an intensity and a clarity that the extreme circumstances of her situation both forced upon her and sharpened to a fine edge. She could not waste time. She had somehow understood this even before she could have known how little time she had. She used what she had. She made of it something that has outlasted everything that tried to destroy her. What did Anne Frank actually do all day? She made herself immortal, one sentence at a time. Well, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. We hope that this deep dive into Anne Frank's daily life in the secret annex has given you a richer and more complete understanding of the extraordinary young woman behind one of the most famous diaries ever written. If you found this video moving and informative, please make sure to check out our other videos exploring the lives of remarkable people from the Second World War era. And if you enjoyed learning about the daily life, the hopes, the writing, and the legacy of Anne Frank, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another piece of history. See you in the next one. Let us pause here and look more carefully at some of the specific entries and experiences that shaped Anne Frank's daily life in ways that deserve closer attention. The diary entries from specific days in the hiding period reveal patterns and details that a survey cannot fully convey, and it is in those specific details that the full texture of the life she led becomes vivid. Consider, for example, the entries from the autumn and winter of 1942, the first months of hiding. Anne was new to the experience, and everything was still raw. The entries from this period have a quality of hyper-alertness, of someone noticing everything because everything is strange and potentially significant. She describes the sounds of the building, the creak of the staircase, the rumble of the warehouse workers' carts below, the drip of the leaky tap in the bathroom. She describes the smells, the persistent odour of spices from the warehouse below, the smell of cooking from the Van Pell's kitchen upstairs, the particular staleness of air that has been breathed too many times in too small a space. She describes the quality of silence in the annex during the day, not true silence but a constructed, deliberate, effortful silence that required constant vigilance to maintain. These sensory details accumulate into a portrait of an environment that is in many ways unlike anything most readers have ever experienced, and yet Anne renders it with such precision that it becomes fully imaginable. She also describes, in those early months, the process of adjusting to the other inhabitants. The arrival of the Van Pell's family had been planned for, but the reality of sharing the space with people whose habits, rhythms and personalities differed from the Franks was something that required active management. Auguste Van Pels was louder and more demonstrative than Edith Frank. Herman Van Pels smoked his pipe, which created an odour that permeated the whole annex and which Anne found deeply unpleasant. Peter Van Pels had a cat, Moshi, whose presence caused a running series of practical problems. The cat shredded things, the cat knocked things over. The cat occasionally escaped from Peter's room and wandered through the annex at precisely the wrong moment. The cat also, according to some diary entries, used the warehouse below as its bathroom, which created a smelly complication for the helpers. But the cat also provided something that the annex genuinely needed, which was a presence of unconditional, uncomplicated affection. Peter was devoted to Mushi and the cat was devoted to him, and this small domestic warmth was a real comfort in an environment full of tension. The Van Pels family's dynamics were themselves a constant subject of observation for Anne. She watched the marriage between Herman and Auguste with the sharp attention of a budding novelist, noting the ways their relationship was both affectionate and mutually exasperating, how they bickered constantly about small things while clearly remaining genuinely committed to each other. She noted Herman's tendency to dominate conversations and Auguste's equal tendency to ignore this and continue talking regardless. She noted the way they both turned to Otto Frank in moments of real difficulty, trusting his calm judgment in a way that revealed how much his personality stabilized the whole group. Herman Van Pels was also, despite the difficulties of his character, a genuinely useful presence in the annex. He had practical knowledge that proved valuable, particularly his expertise with meat and spices, which allowed the group to make better use of the food they had than they might otherwise have managed. When they occasionally obtained a piece of meat through the helpers' contacts on the black market, Herman Van Pels was the one who knew how to process and store it properly. The subject of the black market deserves some attention because it was a significant part of how the annex survived. Food rationing under the Nazi occupation made it impossible to legally obtain enough food for 8 people without producing 8 ration books, which would have revealed the existence of 8 people. The helpers obtained extra ration books through a variety of means, some legitimate and some not. Victor Kugler had contacts who could supply additional coupons. Johannes Kleiman had his own network. Miep Gies knew suppliers who would sell without requiring coupons if the price was right. The whole operation of feeding 8 people in hiding was a complex logistical undertaking that required constant improvisation and occasional rule-bending, and the helpers navigated it with great skill over more than 2 years. The food that resulted from these efforts was, over time, increasingly monotonous. The diary contains numerous complaints about the repetitiveness of meals, with certain foods appearing so frequently that they became private jokes and then genuine sources of despair. Red cabbage in particular appears to have been on the menu with almost insulting regularity, and Anne records her feelings about red. cabbage in several diary entries with a comic precision that reveals just how much mental energy the inhabitants devoted to the subject of food when they had so little else to vary their days. Brown beans were another recurring tormentor. She describes a period in which the annex ate brown beans for lunch every day for an extended stretch, until the sight of brown beans became almost physically nauseating. Canned food of various kinds provided additional sustenance, but also additional monotony. The helpers made every effort to vary the diet when they could, bringing special treats for birthdays and holidays. But the underlying reality was that food was scarce and getting scarcer as the war continued, and the Nazi economic grip on the Netherlands tightened. The shorthand studies deserve a fuller treatment because they were one of the things Anne was genuinely excited about, and that she worked at with sustained effort. Shorthand was a practical skill with real post-war utility. If she became a journalist, knowing shorthand would be essential. She worked through a Pitman method manual, learning the system of symbols that condensed ordinary letters and sounds into rapid notation. She practiced diligently, writing out exercises and testing herself on speed and accuracy. She also tried teaching Margot some of the system, though Margot's interest was less sustained. Anne was not a natural with the more technical and systematic aspects of learning. She preferred the humanities and found algebra genuinely difficult, but she applied herself to shorthand with a pragmatic energy that suggests she took the post-war future seriously and was actively preparing for it. The French studies were more consistently pleasurable for her. She had been studying French before going into hiding and had a reasonable foundation. In the annex, she continued through grammar books and vocabulary practice, and over the 2 years of hiding, she developed a genuinely solid command of the language. Reading some French texts in the original, she was also working on her English, which she had some background in, and she was attentive to English radio broadcasts in a way that both served her English studies and kept her informed about the war. German was, of course, her original language, the language she had spoken at home in Frankfurt before the move to Amsterdam. And while she had long since made Dutch her primary language, her German remained functional, and she followed German-language news broadcasts with facility. The relationship between Anne and Margot, which we touched on earlier, had a specific texture that is worth examining more closely. Margot Betty Frank is one of the most significant and yet least fully understood figures in the diary, partly because Anne's characterizations of her are coloured by the inevitable distortions of sibling perspective, and partly because Margot, unlike Anne, left no diary of her own that has survived. Margot apparently did keep a diary during the hiding period, but it was never found. We know her primarily through Anne's eyes, and Anne's eyes, though sharp, were also the eyes of a younger sister who adored and competed with and was simultaneously dependent on and occasionally resentful of her older sibling. What comes through clearly in the diary is that Margot was an exceptional young woman in her own right. She was academically brilliant, consistently achieving results in her correspondence courses that Anne found humbling. She was emotionally mature and self-contained, managing the stresses of hiding with a composure that Anne both admired and found slightly intimidating. She was deeply considerate of others, noticing when someone was struggling and responding with quiet kindness. The letter she wrote to Anne about Peter van Pels, giving her blessing to the relationship she could see developing, is a document of unusual generosity and emotional grace. Margot also had ambitions of her own, not for writing as Anne did, but for medicine. She wanted to be a midwife or a nurse, to work in the land that was then called Palestine, to be part of building a new world. She had clear, specific plans, and she worked toward them with the systematic application that characterized everything she did. The sisters shared the same room throughout the hiding period, and this sustained physical proximity created a relationship that was both deeply intimate and occasionally suffocating. They could not avoid each other. They could not have privacy except in thought. They saw each other at their worst and at their best. They argued over small things, as siblings always do, and they also had the kind of conversations that can only happen between people who know each other completely. Anne describes several late-night conversations with Margot in the diary, lying in their beds in the dark and talking in whispers about the future, about boys, about what they feared, about what they hoped. These conversations are among the most tender passages in the diary. The fate of the helpers is a story that deserves to be told alongside the story of the annex inhabitants, because without them there would have been no hiding and no diary. Victor Kugler was arrested on August 4, 1944, and sent to a series of labour camps. He survived the war by escaping from a prisoner work column in March 1945 and going into hiding himself until liberation. He later emigrated to Canada, where he died in 1989. Johannes Kleiman was also arrested on the day of the raid but was released in September 1944 due to his poor health. He remained in Amsterdam, helped rebuild the depicted business after the war, and became a close friend and collaborator of Otto Frank in the work of preserving Anne's legacy. He died in 1959. Jan Gies, Meep's husband, survived the war without arrest. He had been involved in Dutch resistance activities throughout the occupation. He died in 1993. Bep Voskuil survived the war. Her father, Johannes Voskuil, who had built the bookcase and who had been a vital member of the support network, died of illness in 1945, before the liberation, never knowing whether the people he had risked so much to protect had survived. He had kept the secret faithfully until the end. And then there is Miep Gies. Miep Gies was perhaps the most important non-family figure in Anne Frank's story. The person who bridged the world of the annex and the world outside it most consistently and most intimately. She was 26 years old when the hiding began, and 36 when she finally gave Otto Frank the diary she had kept safe. In the years and decades after the war, she became one of the most important witnesses to Anne Frank's life, speaking publicly about her experiences, writing her own memoir, and receiving numerous honours for her courage, including the Raoul Wallenberg Foundation's Wallenberg Medal. She lived to the age of 100, dying in Amsterdam on January 11, 2010. In her later years, she gave countless interviews and spoke to hundreds of thousands of school children about Anne Frank and about what the experience of the hiding had meant to her. She consistently deflected descriptions of herself as a hero, saying that she had simply done what any decent human being would have done. She was wrong about this. She had done something extraordinary. And the world she had helped preserve through her courage and her faithfulness speaks for itself every time someone reads the diary of the girl she helped to hide. What does it mean to ask what Anne Frank did all day? It means asking what survival looks like from the inside. It means asking what adolescence looks like when stripped of everything incidental and exposed to its essence. It means asking how a human being maintains their humanity when everything around them is designed to deny it. Anne Frank's diary answers these questions not with grand statements, but with the accumulated weight of thousands of small, precise, honest observations. She ate her breakfast. She complained about the cold. She studied her French verbs. She argued with her mother and then felt terrible about it. She fell in love with a boy who was shy and kind and not quite as brilliant as she was, and she loved him anyway. She looked out at a chestnut tree and thought about the sky and the world and the nature of goodness. She revised her diary because she wanted it to be good, because she believed it was going to matter, because she understood even at 15 that the act of writing the truth was an act of resistance against everything that was trying to make her and people like her invisible and disposable and forgotten. She was not forgotten. She will not be forgotten. The diary is not a monument to victimhood, it is a monument to aliveness, to the stubborn, irrepressible, infuriating, marvellous aliveness of a young woman who was given 2 years in a hidden room and turned them into a work that will last as long as there are people to read it. That is what Anne Frank did all day. And it was enough. It was more than enough. Well, that brings us to the end of our video on what Anne Frank actually did all day. We hope you have come away from it with a deeper sense of who she was, not just as a symbol or a name in a history book, but as a real and vivid and remarkable human being who lived fully and intensely in circumstances that would have defeated most people. If this video moved you or taught you something new, please do hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the human stories behind the history. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one. One final detail that has always struck readers who look closely at the diary is the specific moment in which Anne articulates her ambition most clearly. On April 5, 1944, she wrote an entry in which she asked herself directly what she wanted from her life. She wanted to live on after death, she wrote. She could not imagine a life without a legacy. She did not want to spend her existence on this earth the way her mother had, on domestic duties and housekeeping and being dependent on her husband. She wanted to go on being useful and bring joy to all people, even those who have never met her. She wanted to work for the world and for humanity. And she concluded by writing that this was why she was so grateful to God for having given her this gift, this possibility of developing herself and of writing, of expressing all that is in her. And then she wrote, with the clarity and the certainty that made her unlike almost anyone her age, that she wanted to go on living even after her death. She was 15. She knew she might not survive. She wrote it anyway. The diary was her answer to mortality. Writing was her answer to impermanence. Every day that she sat at her small table in the hidden room and opened her notebook and began to write, she was making a bet against obliteration. She was saying through the act of writing, I was here. I thought these things. I felt these things. I mattered. Read me and know me, and I will still be here. In some real and important sense, after I am gone, she won that bet. She won it completely. The girl in the annex who wrote every afternoon while the silence pressed down and the warehouse workers moved below and the chestnut tree stood in the garden beyond the window, won her wager with time in a way that very few writers in the entire history of literature have managed to do. She is still here. She is still talking. She is still, after all these decades and all these translations and all these millions of readers, the clearest and most immediate voice in the room.